The show is on an absolute hot streak of behind-the-scenes insight, and today, that run continues. We're joined by ESPN sensational beat reporter Brady Henderson, who sat shotgun for the process leading to the Seahawks' first-round pick. Let's light him up. I'm Jacson Bevins, and this is Cigar Thoughts. Welcome back to the Cigar Lounge. I am Jacson Bevins, and along with my determined producer, Mike Barwin, this is the Cigar Thoughts podcast. Mike, how are we doing today?
We're locked in, Jackson. We are absolutely locked in. You know, May is generally doldrum season for the NFL in a lot of people's eyes, but we've got a lot to chew on. Rookie minicamp is in the works. The draft is in the rear view, but there's so many storylines that have come out from that. So we are looking ahead, my friend. How are you?
Doing fantastic, man. And look, last week we got to peek behind the curtain at how front offices approach roster building with NFL analytics consultant Sean Clement. And today we get to chat with someone who had a backstage pass to see how the Seahawks handled this year's draft with the new head coach. But before we get to that conversation, I want to remind everyone listening that Cigar Thoughts is proud to be sponsored by Seattle Cigar Concierge and Glenfiddich Single Malt Scotch Whiskey, two companies of incredible quality. And the big news, as many of you already know, we have teamed back up with Seattle Cigar Concierge for an exciting second release of the Cigar Thoughts cigars. That's right. It's the Cigar Thoughts Red Zone series, which I am smoking right now. It combines a robust taste profile with a smooth Connecticut wrapper and is available to purchase using the link on the show page for the same discounted price of $149 for a bundle of 10 stogies that you've got used to with the Cigar Thoughts originals. My goal with these releases is to provide an avenue to high-end cigars without the high-end cost, and this partnership provides exactly that. They make a great gift as well. So get some for yourself or for someone else by following the link at cigarthoughtsnfl.com. And look, guys, I'm going to be honest with you. This show ain't free to make, and we're happy to do it because we have an absolute blast. But there are two ways y'all listening and watching can help support it so we can keep the episodes coming. One is by purchasing the cigars, which again, come at an astonishing price for the quality. The other is by subscribing to our YouTube channel at Cigar Thoughts, where you can watch full episodes as well as the funny and insightful clips that Mike puts together. And, of course, you can listen to us everywhere you get your podcasts. Listen, man, I've said it before and I'll say it again now, but this show is largely a selfish pursuit for us, isn't it? The fact that so many folks are on board with us is a fantastic bonus, but honestly, we've just created a platform that allows us to talk ball with some of the most knowledgeable and connected people around the NFL, and today's guest is no different. He covers the Seahawks for ESPN and is the author of the ultra-compelling article detailing how the 2024 draft went down for Seattle. He's making his third trip to the Cigar Lounge today, and we couldn't be happier to have him. He is Brady Henderson. Brady, welcome back in.
What's up, Jacson, Mike? Thanks for having me. How you guys doing?
Oh, man, doing great. Better now that you're here. How's your day going? You getting to catch your breath a little bit now that the dust has settled with the draft?
Yeah, I am. Thank you. Yeah, the NFL offseason is really interesting, like from a beat reporter standpoint, just because you have these pockets where it's really busy, like, you know, free agency and the sort of couple weeks before and leading into that and then afterwards, and then kind of the same with the draft. But then you have a lot of these times where there's not as much going on, like in between, you know, the draft and then when the OTAs start, or at least the OTAs that we're allowed to go watch and cover. So you get these fun little windows where you can go, you know, play golf or go, work on the house projects or do whatever you want to do. So this is one of those windows. So happy to be able to join you guys. Although I enjoy doing it so much that I would do it even in the busy period because I like talking to you guys.
Ah, man, we appreciate that. Yeah. I'm glad that you're getting a chance to breathe a little bit and play some golf. I'm going to put you on blast right here. What's the handicap at?
Oh, it's going in the wrong direction. I think I just topped 11. It's 11 something right now.
All right.
Yeah.
No, man. That's pace of play. That's all good.
Yeah.
Well, look, man. Let's jump right into the article everyone was talking about last week. You know, we'll touch on specifics in a bit, but Zooming out to start, you've covered this team long enough to get a sense for how they operate, how John Schneider operates in particular, and this was their first draft without Pete Carroll. And I think as fans, we forget how rare it is for one head coach and one GM to work together for as long as they did. But now we got Mike McDonald in town. Did you get a sense that the draft process was different this year as a result? And if so, how?
Yeah, I really don't think it was all that different aside from, just the position by position. I'm sure they had different kind of specs of what they were looking for under Carroll versus what they are now looking for under Mike McDonald. But, you also saw Nehemiah Pritchett, the cornerback they drafted in the 5th round, sort of looked like a Pete Carroll type of cornerback anyways. Sure. So, I think there's maybe the drafting and the scouting process is a little different. At the end of the day, I don't think it was all that different just because while Pete Carroll had final say for all those years that they were together in Seattle, I mean, everything I've ever heard and continue to hear was that he pretty much let John Schneider run the show in terms of the draft. And so John Schneider was already the guy handling the drafts even before he took over as kind of that main decision maker with the team. And so I don't think it was all that different. The post-draft press conferences, where they bring out Schneider and the head coach after, at the end of every day of the draft. I mean, those were definitely different just because Carroll was not there, but I think by and large it was pretty similar.
Yeah. Well, in that article, you mentioned that Seattle had a number of trade back opportunities. And I said recently that to me, the outstanding theme of the first round, outside of the incredible run on QBs at the top, was how few trade backs we saw early on. And I do think that speaks to the depth of first round grades that teams had on this draft class, right? Like, I think there were more players with a first round grade than you usually see for most teams. So 2-part question for you. One, do you know anything about what was being offered to Seattle specifically to move back? And 2, do you think they would have if Murphy was off the board?
Yeah, and I did not get specifics on what they were offered, but I think that you can look at some of those some of the teams and take educated guesses, right? So one of the teams was Minnesota, which obviously moved back up again to what was it, number 17 with Jacksonville. Yep. And the package of picks that they gave Jacksonville to move up, I think, 6 spots, it was, I mean, in and of itself, it was an okay package. I think value-wise, it might have, lined up when you add up all the points and everything, but there was none of the picks involved were day 2 picks this year, right? It was, I think, mid-round picks this year and then maybe a day 2 pick next year. As far as the Seahawks are concerned, that really wouldn't have done them any good, assuming the same offer or a similar offer was on the table for them. I don't think that would have done them any good, in terms of if they were going to trade back, it would have been to get to pick up another day 2 pick this year, considering they only had one of them. So I think the interesting trade possibility would have been Atlanta, just knowing how far they would have had to move. Remember, Atlanta had already obviously taken Penix at 8. From what I was told, they wanted to move back up again from, what were they in, like the 40s, 45 or something? So if you just look at how far up they would have had to go, you're probably talking about a first round pick next year. That would be my guess as to what they would have had to give up. But again, that wouldn't have really done the Seahawks any good because they would have been moving back from 16 all the way to whatever Atlanta was at, 45. And so, you're not really solving your problem this year. So, and then in terms of the second question was about what would they have done if Murphy was not.
Let's say, because one of the things you reported was that they weren't expecting Murphy to be there at 16.
Right.
You talked a lot about how coy they were in their pursuit of him with the combine, Schneider essentially staying on the opposite side of the building and not extending a top 30 visit, like true smoke screening, right? Like to the full degree that an NFL GM can. And in hindsight, you're like, okay, this is a player that they actually really wanted and must have thought that they had at least a chance in order for them to, make all those maneuvers. But then all of a sudden you see 14 straight or offensive players to start this draft. Do you think that if Murphy was off the board, that all of a sudden those trade back packages start to look a little bit more attractive, or were there other guys there that they would have been happy to stick and pick?
Yeah, I think both are true. Yeah, I think that they would have given it a lot more thought, just because, I do think that those we heard John Schneider say those were some good offers that they turned down. And I don't think he was just saying that just to make it seem like they were that much more in love with Murphy that they turned down these good offers. I mean, they were definitely in love with Murphy. He was their highest rated defensive player. So I don't think Schneider was trying to just sort of say that as a means of, making them seem fortunate to get their guy. I think that they were, just based on where those teams were, again, in a vacuum, I think they were good offers, but for what the Seahawks needed, I don't think they would have made a whole lot of sense, especially considering Murphy was still there. So, yeah, I think they would have been a lot more tempted to take some of those offers if Murphy wasn't there. But I also know that they were really high on the cornerbacks. The three. And then obviously,
so was I. I'm a big Quinyon Mitchell guy. So
Quinyon Mitchell, Terrion Arnold, and then Cooper DeJean. I think they could have drafted any one of those guys in the first round. And I know there was, I think Daniel Jeremiah caught some flack because he had sent one of those guys. I think it was Arnold to Seattle in his mock draft, and everybody lost their what. I think that if Murphy wasn't there, and if we're sort of recreating this whole another alternate reality, if Murphy and CJ Latham were not there, because I think Latham was the other guy other than Murphy. In fact, I know he was the other guy that they were really targeting. If both of those guys were gone, and if maybe they couldn't trade back, or if maybe the trade back offers weren't all that appealing, I definitely think they could have drafted any one of those three cornerbacks, even knowing that all hell would have broken loose. When a team spends its second consecutive first round pick on a cornerback when they're already pretty well set at that position. I think they were, direct quote, I was told, quote, "We were taking the best player no matter what."
Okay. Yeah. We had Sean Clement on last week, who is, the vice president of football analytics for the consulting firm Sumer Sports. And, he worked in front offices on the analytics staffs with the Ravens and the Dolphins. And yeah, it was so interesting to get his perspective on best player available versus positional need, and the thought process that he was explaining that, at least from an analytical perspective, and that a lot of teams have adopted, is with that first round pick, especially if it's in the first half of the first round, just take the best player and figure it out. Right. And I think that we forget as fans how many moves are still on the table between the draft and the start of the season. Right. We saw the Rams, who were maybe the most surprising playoff team from last year, completely overhaul their roster after the draft. We were looking at that team and saying they have like four good players and nobody else. And, they pulled a lot of strings kind of to make that thing happen. You're talking about them turning down these trade backs because it doesn't help them right now. What I'm hearing from you is this is not a team that sees themselves in like a long-term rebuild mode, like a lot of fans are assuming that they're in. This is a team that is trying to win right now. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, that was one of the pieces of sort of rationale that I was told that they really considered when they were, weighing those trade backs. And, again, start from the standpoint of they felt very fortunate that Byron Murphy was there. So I think that was the first piece of it, is that they got, in their minds, the best defensive player falling to them at 16. So that was, reason number one to stay there. But another one was, and I was told this directly by somebody in the front office, that they felt like, they weren't as inclined. They didn't feel like they were in a sort of such a state of rebuilding that they desperately needed that extra, whatever it would have been, an extra day 2 pick. Like they didn't feel like they needed, that extra pick to bring in another, starting guy right away, or another building block. They just didn't feel like their roster was in that need of that kind of extra draft pick, to where it would have made sense to bypass Murphy at that spot. So I think if they were in more of a true rebuild, then that would have been more tempting. But yeah, that was part of the rationale as I understood it. And so I think you could easily debate that idea. I mean, they were a 9-8 team last year. They still have quite a ways to go, I think, to catch the 49ers, although the 49ers are in a very interesting spot now where you're seeing them.
They are.
talk about potentially having to trade off, even if this window may have passed already. But there was talk they may have to trade off Brandon Ayuk, may have to trade Deebo Samuel because of just the salary cap realities of having such a top heavy roster construction. And so I don't want to.
Well, and they're about to lose their greatest leverage when they extend Brock Purdy, which I think everyone is assuming is going to happen.
Right. Yeah, that would be a year from now, most likely. And so I don't mean to make it sound like they're just never going to catch the 49ers, but I still think that there is a gap there. And so there would have been, I think, merit to the idea of trading back and getting that extra pick. And if you felt like you could still take one of those corners, depending on how far you move back, which as the draft played out, you probably still would have had a chance at one of those guys. There's definitely merit to the other side of thinking, but again, part of the Seahawks rationale was they just didn't feel like they were in such a rebuild that they totally needed that extra pick.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think teams tell you what their intentions are with the transactions that they make. And, when Mike and I started this podcast, it was kind of gruesome. It was that ugly final year of Russell Wilson where he was hurt and the vibes were bad. And we were after the trade, there was this assumption, this is right around the time we had you on for the first time. There's this assumption that when they traded Russell Wilson, that this was a full-on long-term rebuild. And I pushed back on that idea then for two reasons. One, I just don't think tanking works. I think the evidence is overwhelmingly against that being an optimal strategy in the NFL, not in all sports, but certainly in the NFL. The second was the first move they did after that, after trading Russell Wilson, was to sign Quandre Diggs, an older safety, to an extension. That's not a move that you make if you're rebuilding. And so much was made this year about the Seahawks only having a first and a third this year. Well, sort of, except for their second round pick was de facto Leonard Williams, who they extended, right? Yeah. You're not extending an older defensive tackle at, essentially a second tier contract. He's not setting the market, but it wasn't that far below it, the contract that he signed. You're not doing that if you're taking a long-term rebuild approach. So there was no part of me by looking at that says like, oh, this is a team that is expecting to be bad this year and they're going to accumulate assets. And then they essentially used another third round pick on Sam Howell, which at first I was like, really? That's what they did it on? And then the more I thought about it, the more I looked at the landscape, 67 different quarterbacks started a game in the NFL last year. Like, I think the NFL has wised up to the value of having a good second round quarterback. Seattle, they drafted two rookies, but really they left this draft in the first 2 days with Byron Murphy and Leonard Williams and Sam Howell and Christian Haynes. And to me, that's a nice blend of building for the future without sacrificing competition now.
Yeah, and to the overall, the larger point about them not being in a rebuild, I mean, they signed Rayshon Jenkins, who's basically the same age as Quandre Diggs. So that wasn't like, they got rid of a veteran player and then signed, a 25-year-old guy. They signed another just veteran guy, just a cheaper guy. And so, I mean, I'll just kind of take you inside the building a little bit. And you've all heard, everybody has heard John Schneider, one of the things he says, every time he's talking about roster building is they want to be, quote, a consistent championship caliber team. So that's his way of saying they're never really going to be that team that truly embraces a rebuild. Now, I wondered if that might be different when Pete Carroll was fired, just because I wondered how much of that mindset was the head coach, who his whole mantra is always compete. And I wondered if the aversion to being that team that sometimes embraces the rebuild is because you got a head coach who would never go for it. I don't think that's the case. I think that was just as much John Schneider as it was Pete Carroll. And in fact, when we during the draft, just to take you into the building a little bit, like they let the reporters go to parts of the building where we would normally wouldn't be allowed to go. One of them is like upstairs on the second floor where they have all their position meeting rooms. They have this one it's their big defensive meeting room. That's where they set all the reporters up during the draft, just because the main media room is not big enough. But anyways, I was walking there and a Seahawks employee was sort of walking me from one part of the building to the other. And we walked by this wall that I think was outside where like the scouts offices are. And it's on the wall, written on the wall, is that Schneider saying consistent championship caliber team. So again, that was not just a Pete Carroll thing. I think that is just as much a John Schneider mantra as it was, Carroll's desire to always compete. And so you're just not going to see this team embrace a true rebuild as long as that guy's still
Were
there.
there any pictures of Richard Sherman on that wall? The tip,
not on that wall.
Iconic franchise moments. Oh, disappointing.
Yeah.
Disappointing.
We could talk about that whole thing. Yeah, that was an interesting storyline. But and I'm sure you guys saw the video that they did where I think it was Schneider and McDonald posted up right in front of the picture of Richard Sherman, just to send everybody a reminder that they haven't scrubbed all of the LOB era pictures from the building.
Big grin on Schneider's face.
Yeah. Totally. It's funny because we have in some ways a big shift in the culture because Pete Carroll was as much a part of the Seahawks DNA as anybody else in that building. But at the same time, it's like, a reset is not necessarily a restart. And, I had the opportunity to go and co-host a show with KJR last week with Dick Fain for a few hours and had a blast. But we had Hugh Millen on that show, and he brought up an interesting point. He said, he called Mike McDonald the preeminent defensive mind on the planet right now. And I think if you look at his track record, there's a case to be made for that. Not just because he turned around both Michigan's defense and Baltimore's, but Baltimore won the Triple Crown last year. Fewest points, most sacks, most turnovers. Like, that's so rare to do. That's Legion of Boom era stuff. But one thing about league defining defenses is there's the shelf life on that before it gets figured out. The offensive minds in this game and the emphasis on offensive talent is so strong that you do have a finite window where if you believe that Mike McDonald is the or one of the best defensive minds on the planet, that isn't necessarily going to last forever. And so you kind of have to make the most out of this window where he is at the top of that game. And I like that take. Like, you can't just punt years of this. And I think this is the part of tanking that people tend to overlook, is you are wasting years of the good assets that you have when you're losing on purpose.
Yeah, and it's not just head coach; it's the players themselves who have a short shelf life. I mean, does DK Metcalf want to rebuild until he's 28 years old? And I mean, I'm sure he's still going to be a great player by then. But it's the players themselves. Your star players do have that sort of shelf life too. And in a few years,
well, you're just punting his contract at that point. You're just giving money away. Like, you're paying the guy $25 million a year.
Yeah, and you have all of these guys that you've drafted the last couple of years of really productive draft classes that are gonna their contracts are gonna come due here pretty soon, and so I agree with you. I mean, I Mike McDonald, you would think that a guy who was smart enough to kind of figure out his defensive scheme and figure out a system that works incredibly well, you would think that he'd be able to adapt to whatever the league, whatever opposing offensive minds throw at him, whatever rule changes the NFL makes to try to, promote more offense in the NFL. Like, you would think he'd be able to kind of go with the flow there and overcome that, but you never know. And you just never know what your roster is going to look like a few years from now. So I agree with you. And I've really remembered the thing that you said about that, what the other side of that too, which is that, I think you said losing leaves scars in an organization, or it was something to that effect. I think that's another part of it too. Is these guys, like, they're used to winning, they want to win. When you go out there and you make it sort of clear to them that winning is not your priority, I think that sets a pretty bad tone in your organization too.
Thank you. Yes, amen. We are not playing fantasy football here, man. Like, you win because of the guys in the building who are very special human beings who are wired a very specific way. And the idea that losing is going to increase your employer's chances of replacing you is not a great motivator for these guys. And also, for all of the advanced metrics that we have, and I'm a fan of most of them, and I believe in incorporating an analytical approach, still, the greatest indicator of future success is past success. And winning games begets winning games. And I just think that should always be the goal in the NFL. In other sports, you can definitely make a case. But in the NFL, windows for these players' careers and coaches' careers are so short. You got to kind of strike while you can. One other thing that you said in your article that really struck me, and I think I agree with it, but I was a little surprised at how surprised I was when I read it. In your piece, you said the defensive line is now the most well-stocked position group on Seattle's roster. And I don't think anybody would have considered that unit to be a strength for Seattle last year. How much of that is the unit just underperformed with the talent they had versus Byron Murphy can be a transformative force now?
Yeah, I was looking at that more from just a numbers standpoint. And I'm not saying I think that group is going to light the world on fire, because they certainly didn't do that last year. And I'm not sure.
That's right.
I'm not sure how much one player is going to make a difference. Now, I think that that one player being Byron Murphy, plus, the having a new defensive coordinator there, I think that has the potential to make a pretty big difference. But I meant that more in terms of the numbers standpoint. And really what I was getting at there is I wondered immediately after the draft, or immediately after they took Murphy in the first round, if there might have to be another shoe to drop there. Just knowing that they had to create some cap space, which they've started to do in other ways. Knowing that they would have to create some cap space, and that they may have to create like an opportunity for some of these guys to play. Now, I was told that that's not the plan. There wasn't, and specifically, I'd wondered about Jarran Reed. Like, would they consider trading Jarran Reed to free up a few $1 million and to free up what may be a bit of a logjam at that spot? I was told that that's not the plan. They don't feel like they have to, like, they're going to have to free up some more money, but they've got other ways that they can do that. And you already saw them do one of those moves by restructuring Mike Jackson's contract. I wonder if they're going to do the same thing with John Radigan. They can do some simple restructures, convert salary to signing bonus with DK Metcalf. They could do it again with Geno Smith if they wanted to. But the other part of that is that Mike Macdonald plans to rotate those defensive linemen a lot more than they did last year. And like, if you look at some of the playing time percentages on those guys, Jarran Reed, I think, played 50 snaps a game, which that's a lot for a defensive lineman. Now, part of that was that their defense was so lousy that the defense they had the most defensive plays of any team, but you shouldn't be asking a 300-pound guy to play 50 snaps a game. Leonard Williams played quite a bit after he arrived. So the plan is to rotate those guys more. And there's a thought in the building that part of the reason their run defense got gashed as often as it did is because at times those guys were just gassed from being overworked.
Yeah, and there's so many things about the reality of the NFL that slip through the cracks with the fan experience. Playing defensive line on a per snap basis takes so much more energy than playing offensive line. Offensive line is mostly a reactive position, and you cover less ground. You are reacting to the energy that's put out by the defensive lineman. When you're playing defensive line, man, it is just a full high resistance sprint for 6 to 8 seconds. And then you get 40 seconds to catch your breath and do it again. And I mean, if anyone's ever pressed themselves that way in the gym, you know how quickly you get gassed. And there's a reason that defensive lines are so much deeper than offensive lines. And you almost cannot have too much depth at that position, within the constraints of your roster build. Now, zooming back out a little bit, stepping back, looking at this team as a whole, taking into account everything they've done in terms of the draft, free agency, coaching hires, because it's not just a new head coach, right? It's new coaches almost across the board. In your opinion, does this team feel closer to contending or further away than they were at this point last year?
Yeah, that's a question I've really wondered about myself. I know you bring me on here for definitive answers and definitive opinions, and I'm afraid that I'm gonna. I honestly don't know. I think that in the long run they will be better off. I think just based on what I know about Mike Macdonald, what I've observed, what I could tell about just his sort of plan of what little we know about it right now. But just I believe in Mike. I believe he was the right coach for them. I believe he was a good hire, and I think it's hard sometimes to see this when you're really in the moment and for somebody who's there every day. But taking a step back, it's a lot easier to see now that this was not a very well coached team the last couple of years, and it wasn't as easy to really realize that in the moment. Maybe it was for other people, and maybe I was just all wet for the last few years, but they were not a very well coached team, and I think that they will be a better coached team going forward. But you sort of alluded to it in the question, like, you have a first-time head coach who's 36 years old. You have a first-time NFL defensive coordinator who's never been a coordinator at that level. You have an offensive coordinator who's done it before but has never coached in the NFL. Same thing with your special teams coordinator. Like, I think there's only one coach who was here last year. That's a ton of newness, a ton of inexperience. Crazy? Yeah, that they're going to have to work through. And I think you're kidding yourself if you think that there's not going to be some level of growing pains, across the board there. I mean, Mike McDonald is going to have to deal with things that have never fallen on his doorstep as a coordinator. I mean, players fighting, like stuff that goes on behind the scenes that we don't know, or that, don't get out, like serious situations that as the head coach, those now fall on your doorstep. And how are you going to handle those? How are you going to handle, a 3-game losing streak when your players start to get pissy and, your star receiver wants the ball more? Like, there's just, I think from an X's and O's standpoint, they will be better off, but just a lot of newness and inexperience that I think they're going to have to work through.
ESPN put out a first set of post-draft power rankings that you contributed to, and they had the Seahawks ranked 21st in the league when they were ranked 20 post-free agency. And it mentioned that the most improved position group was the defensive line. Do you think that 21 is an accurate representation of where the team sits as of now with all of those check-in later variables that have been introduced to the equation?
If I was just plotting out where I thought they should be, just based on what I know about them, and then what little I know or what less I know about the other 31 teams, I would probably say they're a little better than that, probably in the 20s or probably in the teens. Sometime like somewhere around middle of the pack. I think the issue with power rankings is that you have people like me who cover the Seahawks and who know a lot about the Seahawks. I don't know everything there is to know about the Jaguars. So I don't really know their roster in and out. I don't know how good they're going to be. I have just a kind of a loose idea. So I think power rankings and Pro Bowls and All Pros would be a lot more accurate. The voting would be a lot more accurate if it was like NFL personnel people doing the voting. So that's my way of saying, don't stop reading them, but they're not always like the best gauge. I think the great thing we do with ESPN Power Rankings is it's not just a straight up ranking. It's you're learning something about the team because there's a theme to every rankings there. So for this one, it was what's the most improved area on every team. And so there's blurbs there where you can learn about the team beyond just where 50 or so writers, reporters think how they stack up against each other.
I guess the better way to phrase that question is, do you think that there will be 20 teams with a better record at the end of the 2024 season than the Seahawks?
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. So they picked 16th, so they were right in the middle of the pack last year. I don't say that because I think that you pick up where you leave off necessarily, but I'm going to say no. I'm going to say they're going to end up a little bit better than that. But I don't look at this team and say that they're a threat to, make a deep run in the playoffs. And if they surprise me, then they do, and they might, just because sometimes it's hard to have a great feel for what a team's going to be in the offseason. But I think they will be a little better than that. I just still, with the newness and just not as many difference makers as you see on other teams, certainly San Francisco. I mean, I just don't know how they're going to get past San Francisco. I think they're a lot better equipped than they were last year, just with the better defensive mind at head coach to match wits with Kyle Shanahan. But I just still think they're another difference maker or two away from truly being like a team capable of making a real deep run in the playoffs.
Yeah,
as I see it.
Yeah, I think that's a really accurate way of putting it. Mike and I were talking about right actually as you kind of hopped on with us before we hit the air. Mike and I were talking about this, and I was saying I'll let anybody pick the dollar amount, there's not going to be 20 teams with a better win-loss record than Seattle last year. I mean, like, look, everything could change with one injury, right? I mean, the Chargers were going to be way better last year if Justin Herbert doesn't get hurt, right? Like there's a change, but I also think that, you know, Sam Howell could keep the ship afloat if Geno goes down. But, you know, assuming health across the board, I see this as a team that, with, to your point, which I totally agree with, in-game coaching and like the details of coaching has really struggled with this team for a few years. I think Pete was excellent at the stuff that you were surmising is going to be a challenge for Mike Macdonald, not because of Mike Macdonald, but because of him and his staff's relative inexperience in their current roles at the NFL level, is dealing with all of the personal stuff that goes into NFL success or failure. I think Pete Carroll was excellent at that.
Yeah.
But I think his coaching staff got out-coached consistently on Sundays. But I think this is going to be a team that's more disciplined, that is sharper in their responsibilities. And then I look at them personnel, and I look at the offense. Quarterback's the same. Running backs are the same. Wide receivers are the same. Yeah, you lost some depth at tight end, but your best tight end is still there. Presumably, you're better on the interior of the offensive line now than you were before. So offense is probably the same or a little bit better from a personnel standpoint. Defense, you lost some linebackers and you lost some safeties, but the corners are still there. The defensive line is better than. Like, I don't see, unless Mike Macdonald and his staff are just woefully unprepared to run a program, and there will be growing pains there, I just don't see how this team got worse this offseason than a team that's won 18 games over the last 2 years, despite most of the NFL media seeing them 2 years ago as being like a future picking in the top 5. Which they did thanks to the Broncos, but not because they lost, right? Like, this is a team that was supposed to be bad and they were still pretty good. And then the next year they were still pretty good. And honestly, I think their 9-8 is seen worse because they surprised everyone by starting off 5-2. I think if they had started off 2-5 and finished 9-8, we might still see Pete Carroll as the head coach, right? So I do think this is a team with 9-win true talent, at least, because we've seen that borne out for 2 consecutive seasons. I also think they got incrementally better this offseason.
Yeah, I think the easiest thing to predict about this team is that their run defense should be better. And that's pretty easy to say because it can't get any worse. But think about how much of their struggles over the last 2 seasons could be traced back to that. I mean, remember, they're actually pretty good in run defense, I think, in 2021, and then they just fell off the planet the last 2 years. And I would say, by and large, in 2022, they overachieved, relative to expectations and relative to, the quarterback situation, at least what we thought of it initially. But that defensive line, or that run defense, underachieved. And that was obviously the case last season. But just look at the names they have there. There's no way that the players in the front 7 the last 2 years, there's no way that should have been the worst run defense in the NFL in that span. And so I think talent-wise, they're better than they were, and they weren't terrible to begin with talent-wise, but they're better than they were. And they have a coach who, by all accounts, should put them in better position to get better results. And so if you just think of how many games they've lost over the last couple of years, just because their run defense was so terrible, quite a few of them, I would say, then they should be better than, there shouldn't be 20 other teams that are better than them. So that's why I still don't think of them as a Super Bowl contender by any means, but they seem better, or they seem like they should be better than the 21st team in the NFL. I just think, 9 or 10 wins, maybe 11 if everything breaks their way. I mean, the schedule is interesting because it looks like they're going to face quite a few of these teams with rookie quarterbacks. Mm-hmm. And a lot of those games are on the road too. And so, I think that they've got a chance to, I wouldn't say it's an easy schedule overall, but they've got a chance to take advantage of some of these teams with rookie quarterbacks, I think.
Yeah. And we're talking about a head coach whose defenses befuddled the best quarterbacks in the NFL last year. I mean, they had the 49ers offense that was an absolute howitzer all season. They had them in hell on Christmas, right?
Yep.
I mean, they were a Zay Flowers fumble away from probably beating the Chiefs in the AFC Championship and potentially winning a Super Bowl. This is an extremely good defensive coach. And so, yeah, you got to assume that they're going to be a little bit better there. And I think a lot of people sometimes hear my commentary, read my commentary on the team as being a little too Pollyanna-ish, right? Because, the Seahawks aren't in a position to win a Super Bowl, so they're failing. I think Super Bowl or bust is a miserable way to be a football fan. But, look, do that if you want to. Just understand that all else being equal, you're going to be miserable 97% of the time. I choose not to do that. I'm not sitting here saying the Seahawks are ready to compete for a Super Bowl. I think they're closer than a lot of people think, though. And I think it's easy to forget how quickly the NFL landscape shifts.
Yeah.
Like 2 years ago, you tell me the Lions are one play away from going to the Super Bowl? No way. No way. No, Dan Campbell was a joke. Jared Goff was a joke. And now he just signs for $170 million guaranteed an extension. And I'm kind of like, well, yeah, keep this thing together. Like, why would you pivot right now? And the Seahawks aren't quite where the Lions are right now. But I don't think that gap is very big. And I don't think a year ago, many people would have said that gap was very big.
Right. And the Seahawks have beat the Lions in Detroit, I think, the last couple of years, right? So, I mean, there's always a danger in making ironclad assumptions about how a team looks on paper, and teams that you think are, in rebuilds this time of year, sometimes are actually a lot closer to contention than you realize. I think back to, the Rams last year. I remember I was just, because the schedule was coming out, I went back and looked up at, some of the things I wrote about the Seahawks schedule when it came out last year. And I had a line in there about, they should beat the Rams in week 1 because the Rams are rebuilding. Well, the Rams ended up going 10-7 and lost by a point to the Lions in the wild card round. So, they were a team that was a lot better than people thought. And I think the takeaway there is that when you've got a good head coach, then you're a little bit better than just the sum of your talent would otherwise indicate. And so if the Seahawks really do have the right coach in Mike Macdonald, then they maybe not be as much of a rebuild as people might assume just from a few thousand feet away.
Yeah, I mean, the goal is to put yourself in contention and give the chips a chance to fall in your favor. And if your goal is, Jared Goff isn't good enough or Geno Smith isn't good enough, then you say, you need to have Patrick Mahomes then is the conversation, or you need to have Tom Brady. And if you don't have that guy, well, shit, man, why even try? Why even try?
Yeah.
Right? Like when you have good players, you do everything you can to keep them on that team without sacrificing your ability to add to it down the road. Brady, I got one last question for you before we get out of here. After the draft, the rookies have a chance to get on the field and kind of start to get their first NFL reps in. What was your first initial kind of impression from seeing some of these guys out on the field?
Yeah, it's really hard to really glean a whole lot from the rookie minicamp, especially when you realize a lot of their picks were linemen. Three of the 8 picks were linemen. That's the last guy that's the last position group that you can really evaluate, just because there's no contact. You're basically just seeing how these guys look in pads and you're just in helmets, basically. How they move around, even other positions like cornerbacks, you can't really tell how they play just because they're not making plays on the ball. So it's really purely just, how eye test and does the guy look the part or not. One of their draft picks wasn't even practicing, AJ Barner, because he's got, I think, a hamstring injury. But my impression of him was he looks even bigger than 6'6" and 250. He looks even bigger than that. Impression of Byron Murphy was that he looks super quick, and we all know he's not like the most traditionally built defensive tackle because he's an inch or two shorter than some of those guys, but he just looks really stout, really powerful, really explosive. Probably my biggest takeaway from the first day was that the quarterback play was so lousy, and that's to be expected to some degree because you get these guys in there on a Thursday, throw a playbook at them, and then they're trying to learn parts of the playbook on the fly while throwing to receivers that they've never thrown to. So the quarterback play was so bad the first day that it was really hard to evaluate anything else that happened. And then that kind of settled down the next day. But that's my long-winded answer, my way of saying that there wasn't a whole lot to be gleaned other than, some of these guys, you look like they look like, you could tell why they drafted them where they did, just because they look like they have the size, they look the part of, an NFL player. But that's really all you can tell from this time of the year.
Yeah, you have to extrapolate so much from those reps, but I do think there is something to be gleaned from just seeing how guys move within their own bodies, right? Because you've seen enough rookies come through now at this point that you have a little bit of historical perspective that you can weigh these guys against. And if you do see someone like Byron Murphy who moves really well within his body, I mean, I think that's one of the things. He does not have a prototypical defensive tackle body, like you said. But man, you watch that guy play, he plays so much bigger than his size, and he's like a supercharged Puna Ford, and that leverage is on his side because of the way that he's built. And if he can maximize that with the crazy fast twitch abilities that he has, you can see the path to success. I mean, look, people have made the Aaron Donald connection from a play style standpoint. Insanely irresponsible to put that kind of expectation on him. But in terms of a blueprint, Donald was another guy drafted around the same spot that Byron Murphy was, kind of towards the back half of those lottery picks, who just took advantage of the fact that he was smaller than the prototypical defensive tackle. So listen, Brady, man, your time is so valuable to us. We know how much you have to do with your job covering this team. The fact that you're carving out an hour to chat with us means the world, man. Thank you so much.
Hey, well, like I said, guys, I really appreciate the opportunity to do it. It's a lot of fun, and I will make time whenever you guys want me to do it. I enjoy it. So you just say the word, I'll be there. And that the same goes for golfing. If you guys ever want to golf, you just say the word and I'll show up. I'll probably show up about 5 minutes before the tee time. That's just kind of my MO, as my friends will tell you. So you might get a little nervous, but I'll be there, and I'll be ready to play some golf.
Hey, that's all right, man. Breakfast ball is on the menu. That's good by me. But we are definitely making that happen this off season. All right, I, we'll meet somewhere. We'll tee it up. We'll get some real conversation in. Listen, y'all, that is going to do it for today. Brady, you are the man. Thank you again for rapping with us today. Before we let you go, where can the listeners and the viewers find more of you?
Yep, just ESPN.com and then Twitter at Brady Henderson.
As always, you can find Mike and I on social media as well. I am on Twitter at Jacson Bevins. That's Jacson. Mike is on Twitter at Mike Barwin, and the show itself is at Cigar Thoughts. You can catch full video episodes on our YouTube channel at Cigar Thoughts, and find the rest of our socials at cigarthoughtsnfl.com. As mentioned previously, this episode is brought to you by Glenfiddich Premium Single Malt Scotch Whiskey. Y'all know I'm a huge fan of their lineup, and we are thrilled to have them on board as a sponsor of the show. If you're watching on YouTube, you've seen me finishing off a bottle of their 15-year Solera cask. If you want a scotch that combines an initial kick with an incredibly smooth finish, then Glenfiddich is for you. One of the great things about a great scotch is how well it plays with a good cigar. And once again, we do have our own special release of cigars that you can purchase at a terrific price as a listener of the show. The release of these Cigar Thoughts Stogies has been successful enough for us to continue offering them for the low price of $149. That's right, only $149 for a bundle of 10. As many of you know, we partnered with one of the most prestigious cigar manufacturers in the world to release these official Cigar Thoughts cigars, which you can order directly from cigarthoughtsnfl.com. Just follow the link on the show page to get these easy-to-smoke stogies rolled with 13-year aged premium Dominican tobacco leaf, or hit us up on Twitter or Instagram and we'll send you the details directly. The cigars come with a Bovita humidification pack and a Mylar storage bag to make sure they stay fresh whether you have a humidor or not. Of course, you can listen to this show and read every article at fieldgoals.com, and if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and you like the show, drop us a 5-star rating and leave a quick review. Thank you to all of y'all listening for your continued support of the show. We know you've only got so much time for podcasts in your life, and it's an honor to be a part of that for y'all. Please know that by sharing this show on social media and with your friends, you give us the juice to keep making this happen. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, onwards and upwards, my friends.